she was the first to wake up and the last to fall asleep. The quiet force that held her family together, unnoticed, unthanked. When he died, everyone remembered him. But somehow, she disappeared. Until one day, she spoke. This is not just the story of a mother. It's the awakening of a woman who was always there, just never seen. Dove, the Forgotten Mother. A story of sacrifice, silence, and becoming. Stay with us. You'll never see your mother the same way again. Make sure to stay with us until the very end, you won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Part 1. She was the first to wake up and the last to sleep. Margaret's day always began before the sun had a chance to stretch over the Kansas plains. While the world still lay heavy in sleep. She was already up, her bare feet brushing across the cold tile of the kitchen, the kettle hissing softly on the stove, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee curling through the air like a quiet promise. She moved like a ghost, but everything she touched held warmth, the neatly ironed shirts, the oatmeal sweetened just the way her children liked, the handwritten lunch notes folded into brown bags. By the time anyone else stirred, Margaret had already lived a full morning. She was the kind of woman who gave without asking. Who stayed steady when everything else trembled. David, her husband, used to joke that the house would collapse without her. But he didn't say it often, and he never said it in front of the kids. Because like most things Margaret did, her contributions became invisible, like the air, only noticed in its absence. And now, David was gone. The funeral came on a cold Monday. The church was packed, not because David was famous, but because he was familiar. A good man. A quiet man. Friends and neighbors took turns standing at the pulpit, voices thick with grief and reverence. They spoke of David's years as a schoolteacher. His wry humor. The way he mowed his lawn in perfect diagonals. His famous chili. But no one mentioned Margaret. No one spoke of the nights she sat by David's hospital bed, holding his hand even as his memory slipped through time like sand. No one remembered how she read to him when he forgot how to read. Or how she learned to administer his injections, despite her trembling hands. They spoke of David's strength, but they forgot hers. After the service, people hugged her. Polite, brief. They said, he was a great man, and you were lucky to have him. But no one asked her how she was. When the house emptied that evening, Margaret stood alone in the kitchen, her sanctuary, now suddenly foreign. The fridge hummed, the faucet dripped. She stared at the empty chair across from her. A hollowness settled in her chest. It wasn't just grief. It was erasure. Later, as the sky turned lavender and the wind stirred the curtains, she wandered to the hallway, her fingers grazing the family photos. Smiling children. Birthday cakes. David in his Sunday best. There she was, on the edges. Always behind the camera, or caught mid-laugh in the background. Her image blurred, her role assumed. She sat on the sofa with a cup of tea she couldn't taste. A question whispered through her mind, one she'd never dared ask. If I disappeared, would they notice? That night, for the first time in decades, Margaret didn't set the coffee pot. She didn't fold the throw blanket on the couch. She let the lights stay on. She stood in front of the bathroom mirror and stared. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Her face, lined with quiet years. Her eyes, dulled not with age, but with absence of being seen, of being acknowledged, of being named. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I was here, she whispered. I was always here. But the house stayed silent. And that silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Part 2, forgotten at her own table. The days after the funeral bled together like watercolor in the rain, no beginning, no end, just an endless blur of muted tones. Margaret moved through the house like a shadow of herself. Performing the same rituals she had for decades, but now without an audience, without purpose. Breakfast was still made. Beds still tucked. But each motion felt hollow, as though echoing through an empty church. Her daughter, Claire, called once, midweek. "Just checking in, Mom," she said. Her voice was distracted, like she was stirring soup or wrangling a child. "I'm all right," Margaret lied, as she stared out the window at the oak tree David had planted 30 years ago. "That's good. Listen, I'll try to come by Sunday, but things are hectic." Margaret smiled through the phone. "Of course, sweetheart. I understand." But she didn't. Not really. Sunday came and went. Claire didn't. And the silence thickened. That evening, Margaret set the table for two. By habit. She placed David's plate across from hers, then stared at it for a long time before quietly putting it back into the cabinet. She sat down, folded her hands, and ate in silence. No television. No radio. Just the sound of her own chewing and the slow tick of the clock. She missed being needed. There had been a time when the phone rang endlessly. When children shouted her name from every room. When David asked her opinion on everything from dinner plans to insurance forms. Now, the house felt like a museum, full of relics, but empty of life. One afternoon, she walked to the mailbox, clutching her cardigan against the spring breeze. Inside was a single envelope. Claire's handwriting. Hope fluttered for a moment. But it wasn't a letter. It was a form. Power of attorney. A note scribbled at the bottom, just in case something happens. "We'll need this for the bank." Margaret stared at the lines she was supposed to sign. There was no greeting. No "how are you?" Just business. That night, she pulled out a box of old journals from the closet. Pages upon pages of her handwriting, entries from when the children were young, when David still whistled on Sunday mornings. She read them slowly, absorbing her own words like a fading memory. "I miss myself," she wrote in one. "The version of me that mattered." Tears welled up as she traced the words with trembling fingers. Her life had been full, once. Not glamorous, but meaningful. Yet somewhere between raising children and burying her husband, she had been erased. Not out of malice, but out of convenience. One night, unable to sleep, Margaret wandered into the attic. She pulled down photo albums, one by one. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. First days of school. In each photo, she was there, somewhere. A blur in the corner. A shadow behind the cake. But she was always there. And yet, her name was missing from the captions. She sat on the attic floor, surrounded by memories no one else remembered. And for the first time, she let herself say it out loud. I was more than a mother. More than a wife. I was me. She didn't know what came next. But she knew one thing for certain. She would no longer be invisible. And that truth, however fragile, was the first step toward reclaiming herself. Part 3, A Letter Never Meant to Be Sent. The following morning, Margaret found herself at the kitchen table with a pen in her hand and an empty sheet of paper in front of her. The sun had just begun to rise, casting golden rays through the kitchen window. There was something about the hush of the morning that invited honesty. Maybe it was the silence. Or the solitude. Maybe it was the scent of toast and marmalade. But Margaret began to write. Dear Claire, she started. Her pen hovered. Then it moved. I don't know if I'll ever give this to you. I'm not writing it for that reason. I'm writing because there are words I've swallowed for years. Thoughts I've buried beneath casseroles, scraped knees, science projects, and silent grief. She paused. The clock ticked. I was a mother. A wife. A homemaker. But those are just titles. They don't tell you how many nights I lay awake worrying. How many mornings I woke up before anyone else just to make life easier for all of you. I don't say this to ask for praise. I say it because somewhere along the way, I forgot that I existed beyond what I did for others. Her hand trembled. I don't want to vanish while still breathing. I don't want to live in a home where my presence is assumed, not cherished. I don't want to be remembered as just the woman who made your lunch or folded your laundry. I want to be remembered as Margaret. She set the pen down. Her heart was racing. The letter wasn't long. But it was real. It was hers. She folded it neatly and placed it in an old jewelry box, one David had given her decades ago. She didn't seal it. It wasn't time. But something had shifted. She had named the ache. That day, she put on a yellow scarf she hadn't worn in years. She took a walk around the block and smiled at a neighbor. She stopped by the bakery and bought herself a pastry. Not for a guest. Not for company. Just for her. And when she came home, a house felt a little less empty. Not because someone was there, but because she had returned to herself. Margaret didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long while, she was curious to find out. Part 4, A House Full of Voices. And none that said her name. The seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came the relentless Kansas heat, the kind that made the house sigh under its own weight. The windows stayed open, ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, and the days grew long and thick with memory. Claire finally visited. She brought her husband, 2 kids, and an air of hurried obligation. They arrived with grocery bags full of organic snacks, tablets blaring cartoons, and laundry baskets of toys. Claire kissed her mother's cheek absent-mindedly, like a box being checked. "We'll only stay a couple nights," she said, brushing past her. Margaret smiled and opened the door wider. "Stay as long as you'd like." But no one heard her. The house, once a sanctuary of rhythm and care, now thrummed with chaos. Crumbs spilled on the floor Margaret had just mopped. Lights were left on in every room. Conversations happened over her, around her, but never with her. She moved like a caretaker in her own home, the edges of her presence constantly blurred. At dinner, she watched them. Claire laughed at her husband's jokes. The kids fought over chicken nuggets. No one asked about Margaret's day, her thoughts, her memories. At one point, she mentioned David. "He used to love this dish," she said, setting down a bowl of roasted vegetables. Claire didn't look up. Yeah. Hey, Mom, do you still have that old blender?" Margaret nodded and fetched it. That night, they watched a movie in the living room. Margaret sat on the corner of the couch, knees tucked to her chest. Her grandson leaned against her shoulder but didn't speak. Laughter erupted at the screen. Margaret smiled, though she wasn't watching. She felt like furniture, used, then forgotten. After they left, the house fell into silence so dense, it almost had weight. Margaret walked from room to room, picking up forgotten socks, wiping sticky fingerprints from the fridge. She paused in Claire's old bedroom, now transformed into a chaotic storage space. In the closet, she found a shoebox. Inside were drawings from Claire's childhood. Crayon hearts. Stick figures labeled Mommy with big smiles and red dresses. She sat on the floor and ran her hands over each paper. Here, in waxy scribbles, she was loved. Named. Central. So where had that gone? That evening, she lit a candle and placed the box on the kitchen table. She brewed herself a pot of chamomile tea, the way she used to when Claire was sick. As the candle flickered, she whispered aloud. "You used to see me. You used to need me. And somewhere along the way, I became the wallpaper." Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. Not this time. Instead, she reached for her notebook, the same one she had written in since David's passing. She began a new entry. Today, I cleaned up after the people I raised. I fed them. I smiled. I disappeared. Again. She underlined the last word. She closed the notebook and stood. Her spine ached, but her resolve did not. She walked to the hall mirror and met her own gaze. I am not a ghost, she whispered. She repeated it. Louder. I am not a ghost. In the quiet that followed, she imagined a life where her voice filled more space than her silence. A life where her presence was not just convenient, but cherished. And slowly, like the summer moon rising over the prairie, something in her began to stir. A beginning. A reclaiming. A return to self. Part 5. The letter she was never meant to read. It was tucked between pages of an old cookbook, David's handwriting, unmistakable, neat even in its final months. Margaret found it while reorganizing the pantry on a restless Tuesday, after yet another morning of unanswered calls and polite text replies from Claire. The envelope had yellowed slightly. No stamp. Just her name, Margaret, written in the careful way David always addressed things that mattered. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Margaret. If you are reading this, it means I'm gone. And that thought alone makes me want to rewrite this letter 100 times, just to delay its delivery. But here it is. Here we are. I need to say what I should have said more often, thank you. For every cup of coffee you brewed without being asked. For every night you stayed awake with crying babies, with a sick me, with your own worries you never voiced. For making a life that looked simple but was anything but. I know I was quiet. Maybe too quiet. Maybe I hid behind the role of provider and forgot that you were carrying far more than your share. I saw it all, Maggie. I did. I saw the way you held this family together with gentle hands and unspoken strength. I don't know if the kids will ever truly see it. We raised them in a world that praised achievements and forgot the silent work of love. But I see you. And I hope, somehow, they will too. Someday. If I could change anything, it would be to give you more time for yourself. Time to breathe. Time to be seen. Please, Maggie. Don't disappear into the silence. Let them know who you are. Not just who you were for them. With all the love I failed to say aloud, David. She read it 3 times. By the third, tears poured freely. Not from grief, but from recognition. She clutched the letter to her chest, then folded it back neatly and slipped it into her journal. Her heart thudded not with pain, but with something else. A kind of clarity. A kind of calling. Later that evening, Margaret opened her laptop. It had sat on her desk for years, used only for checking grocery deals and the occasional email. This time, she opened a blank document. She began to type. It wasn't a story about David. It was about her. The girl who had dreams before marriage. The woman who learned to mother without a manual. The caretaker who never asked for thanks. The invisible architect of her family's joy. The words flowed, raw, honest, unfiltered. She wrote through the night. By morning, Margaret wasn't the same woman who had cleaned Claire's messes or waited for a call that never came. She had something else now. A voice. And she was finally learning how to use it. Part 6, a voice that would not be silenced. The morning sun filtered through the curtains like soft gold, casting gentle light across the kitchen table. Margaret sat there, her tea cooling beside her, her eyes fixed on the blank page in front of her. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat, steady. Insistent. It dared her to speak. And so she did. What began as a few paragraphs the night before became a stream of thoughts she couldn't dam. Her fingers, though stiff with age, moved swiftly across the keyboard. She wrote about everything. The early years with David, the joy and terror of motherhood, the invisible sacrifices that stitched her life together. She wrote about the silence she lived in, the way her name was spoken less and less over the years. How she had become a function rather than a figure. How love, though once vibrant, had slowly grown mute. She didn't know what the story would become. She only knew it had to be told. The next day, she printed out the first chapter. The weight of the paper felt like proof, like she existed beyond memory. Beyond function. She placed it in a manila envelope, addressed it to herself, and mailed it. When it arrived days later, she opened it with trembling hands, holding the pages as if they were a letter from someone long lost. They were. From the woman she had been. The woman she was beginning to remember. Margaret joined a local writing group. It met every Wednesday afternoon at the library, 6 women. All over 60, each with their own stories tucked into wrinkled hands and weathered hearts. She read aloud in a whisper at first, but they listened like her words mattered. They clapped when she finished. One of them, Helen, wiped away tears. "You should publish this," Helen said, voice quivering. "There are so many of us who feel the same. But we never say it." Margaret smiled. Half embarrassed, half thrilled. "It's just my life." Helen touched her hand. "That's what makes it matter." Encouraged, she kept going. Her journal entries turned into essays. Her memories transformed into scenes. She captured the smallest moments, the socks she folded, the dinners she made. The dreams she gave up, the quiet pride she held for her children even when they forgot her. Claire didn't call for weeks. But this time, Margaret didn't wait by the phone. Instead, she submitted one of her stories to a small magazine. It was titled, "The Woman in the Background." It was raw, real, and for the first time, it bore her name. 2 weeks later, she received an email. They wanted to publish it. She sat in the same kitchen where she had made thousands of meals, clutched the printed acceptance letter, and wept, not from sadness, but from validation. Her voice had made it past the walls of her home. Out into the world. Claire finally called. "Hi Mom," she said, distracted. "Sorry I've been so busy, things have been crazy with the kids." Margaret didn't rush to reassure her. "That's okay," she said softly. Claire continued, "I got your email. The story, the one you published. I read it." Silence hung in the air. "I didn't know you felt that way," Claire said finally. "I mean, I guess I never really thought about what things were like for you." Margaret closed her eyes. "That's because I never told you." Claire sniffed. "It made me cry." "It made me cry too," Margaret said. They stayed on the phone longer than usual. Claire asked questions about Margaret's childhood, about David. About how she managed everything alone. For once, she listened. "I want to read more," she said. "You will," Margaret promised. And she meant it. As autumn crept in, bringing cooler winds and the rustle of falling leaves, Margaret prepared a manuscript. Not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted to leave something behind, not just for Claire, but for herself. A testament. A truth. She changed. Not in loud ways, but in real ones. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She said no when she needed rest. She took long walks without explanation. She bought a bright blue dress just because she liked how it looked in the mirror. She framed one of Claire's childhood drawings and placed it beside her computer. She no longer waited for someone to say her name with reverence. She had learned to say it herself. One afternoon, while dusting the living room, she found an old voicemail from David saved on the answering machine. He had called from the hospital years ago. "Hey Maggie, just calling to say I love you. And, thank you for everything. I don't say it enough." She played it 3 times. Then once more, just to hear her name on his lips. Tears welled up again, but this time, they carried no bitterness. only gratitude. Only memory. She sat at the window and opened her journal, writing with a full heart. I was here. I am here. And now, I am heard. Outside, the wind caught the last golden leaves of fall and lifted them skyward. And inside, Margaret, writer, mother, widow, woman, watched them dance. And smiled. Because for the first time in a very long time, she felt seen. And she wasn't done yet. Part 7, the day she stood tall. The morning dawned colder than usual, yet Margaret stood by the window without her robe. Her hands cradling a mug of tea she hadn't sipped. Her reflection in the glass looked back at her, not a shadow, not a ghost, but a woman taking form. It was the day of the reading. The local community center had invited her and a few others from her writing group to share their work. Nothing grand. No stage lights or velvet seats. Just a room with folding chairs, a cheap microphone, and a few dozen curious faces. And yet, for Margaret, it felt like Carnegie Hall. She dressed with care. Not in black or beige, not the muted tones of blending in. Today, she chose a deep burgundy blouse and a string of pearls David had once given her for their 25th anniversary. She hadn't worn them since the funeral. She curled her hair, dabbed on lipstick. And when she looked in the mirror, she whispered, "You matter." The center was bustling when she arrived. Helen waved her over, her usual warmth wrapped in a marigold scarf. "You look radiant," she said. Margaret smiled. "I feel nervous." "Good. That means it matters." People trickled in, neighbors, strangers, even the librarian who always helped Margaret print her drafts. And then, just before the event began, the door opened again. Claire walked in, her eyes searching until they landed on her mother. Margaret's breath caught. Claire approached slowly, holding something close to her chest, a copy of the magazine that had published Margaret's first story. It was dog-eared, the cover faded from being read too many times. "I wanted to be here," Claire said. "I've been thinking a lot about what you wrote. About everything I missed." Margaret didn't speak. She only reached out and squeezed her daughter's hand. When her turn came, Margaret walked to the front of the room. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it filled the room. She read from her manuscript. Not just the stories of long nights and forgotten birthdays, but of laughter over burnt cookies, of dancing in the kitchen when no one was watching, of holding David's hand through the final silence. She ended with a new piece. One that wasn't yet typed or revised, one she had only just written the night before. "I spent decades speaking softly, thinking it was humility. But I've learned there's a difference between being humble and being erased. I raised a family. I built a life. I carried the weight of others' dreams while setting mine aside. But I am not bitter. I am not broken. I am here, standing, speaking. And that matters." There was silence. Then applause. And through the blur of grateful tears, Margaret saw Claire, standing and clapping the loudest. Afterward, people approached her. Some with questions, others with gratitude. A few elderly women hugged her. A young mother asked if she could share Margaret's story with her book club. Margaret nodded, stunned, moved. Outside, the sky was dimming to a soft lavender. Claire looped her arm through Margaret's as they walked to the car. "I didn't know," Claire said again, her voice tight with emotion. "You were the glue, weren't you? Holding everything together." "I tried to be," Margaret said gently. "But glue gets tired too." Claire stopped, turned to face her. "I see you now. Not just as mom. As a woman. As someone who deserved more." Margaret smiled. "Thank you. That's all I ever wanted." The drive home was quiet but warm. Familiar. When they reached the house, Claire helped her carry a box of printed drafts inside. At the door, Claire paused. Do you think maybe we could work on your book together? Maybe edit it? I'd love to help you finish it. Margaret's heart swelled. I'd like that very much. That night, they sat in the kitchen, where everything had once begun. This time, the table held not plates and placemats, but pages and pens. Claire read aloud while Margaret made notes. They laughed, they cried. They remembered. And somewhere between page 14 and page 28, Margaret felt something shift. It wasn't just healing. It was reclamation. It was the rebuilding of a bridge not just between mother and daughter, but between who Margaret had been and who she was becoming. That night, before bed, Margaret returned to the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back was older, yes, but also wiser, fuller, and quietly powerful. She smiled. I was never invisible, she said. And the house, this time, did not stay silent. It echoed with laughter. It pulsed with presence. And Margaret knew. She hadn't just survived her story. She had finally become its author.